Her family said she would never be a bride, mocked for her intellect in a world that prizes beauty and silence. When scandal leaves her humiliated and abandoned at society's altar, Lady Emmeline retreats to the rugged Cornish coast, never imagining that her greatest humiliation will lead her into the arms of a duke who cherishes her brilliant mind. But will she risk her hard-won independence for a love that seems too extraordinary to be true? The morning sun poured through tall windows into the Fairchild family breakfast room. It made the silver teapots shine and lit up the fresh flowers in the centre of the table. Lady Emmeline Fairchild sat with her back straight, just as she had been taught since she was a little girl. She was 20 years old now, with soft brown hair and kind eyes that lit up when she talked about the stars or books she loved. "More tea, Emmeline?" her mother asked, watching her with worried eyes. "No thank you, mother," Emmeline said. She looked down at the letter in her hands. It was an invite to Lord and Lady Pembroke's big spring ball. Everyone who was anyone in London would be there. Her mother sighed. "This is your third season, Emmeline. 3 years of balls and teas and still no husband." She put down her cup with a small clink. "Your father and I worry." Emmeline tried not to frown. "I know, mother, but must I marry someone who doesn't care about the things I do? What a man cares about before marriage and what he cares about after are two very different things," her mother said. She had said this many times before. A good match is about family names and money, not about stars and books. From across the table, Emmeline's younger sister giggled. "No man wants to hear about how far away the moon is when he's trying to dance with you." "That's enough, Catherine," their mother said sharply. Emmeline stood up. "I think I'll go to the library now. I want to finish my reading before we have to get ready for the Wilsons' tea this afternoon." Her mother's face fell. "More reading? Emmeline, dear, perhaps you could practice your music instead, or work on your stitching. Sir James Harrington will be at the Wilsons today, and he has shown some interest in you." At the mention of Sir James, Emmeline felt a small flutter in her chest. He was handsome and rich, with land in the north. He had danced with her twice at the last ball. "Very well, mother. I'll practice the pianoforte for an hour." Upstairs in her room, Emmeline stood by the window. Below in the garden, the first spring flowers were starting to bloom, pink, yellow and white dots against the green, just like the ladies would look tonight in their pretty dresses, she thought. Her maid, Mary, came in with a fresh jug of water. "Will you be wearing the blue dress today, my lady?" Emmeline nodded. "Yes, and the pearl necklace my father gave me for my birthday." She turned from the window. "Do you think Sir James might ask to court me, Mary?" Mary smiled as she laid out the dress. "I think any man would be lucky to court you, my lady." "But I'm not like other girls," Emmeline said. "I like to learn things. I like to know how the world works." "Mother says I talk too much about such things." "Then maybe you need a man who likes to listen," Mary said simply. Later, as the Fairchild carriage rolled through London's busy streets toward the Wilsons' home, Emmeline watched the world go by. Men in tall hats, women with baskets, kids playing in the road. She thought about Sir James and tried to picture a life with him. Would he let her keep reading her books? Would he laugh at her when she talked about the stars? "Remember to smile," her mother said, fixing a curl that had come loose from Emmeline's hair, "and let Sir James talk about himself. Men like that." The Wilsons' home was already full of people when they arrived. Ladies in fine dresses sat in small groups talking behind fans. Men stood near the windows talking about horses and politics. The air smelled like tea and cake and too many flowers. "Lady Fairchild, Miss Fairchild and Miss Catherine," the man at the door called out as they walked in. Heads turned to look at them. Mrs. Wilson hurried over. "My dears, how lovely to see you." She kissed Emmeline's mother on both cheeks. "And Emmeline, you look beautiful. Sir James was just asking if you would be here today." Emmeline felt her face grow warm. "He was?" Mrs. Wilson winked. "He's by the window with Mr. Peterson. Do go say hello." As Emmeline walked across the room, she felt eyes on her. Lady Hargrove and her 2 daughters watched with thin smiles. They had never been kind to Emmeline, always making fun of her love of books. "She'll never find a husband," she once heard Lady Hargrove say. "Too smart for her own good." But today Emmeline held her head high. Sir James had asked about her. Sir James, with his family name that went back hundreds of years. Sir James, who could dance better than any other man in London. "Miss Fairchild," he said when he saw her. He bowed low. You look lovely today." "Thank you, Sir James," Emmeline said, doing her best curtsy. "Are you enjoying the tea?" "More now that you're here," he said, with a smile that made her heart beat faster. For the next hour they sat together and talked. Emmeline was careful not to mention books or stars. She nodded and smiled as he told her about his horses and his house in the north. When he asked her to walk with him in the garden, she said yes right away. Outside, the air was fresh and cool after the stuffy room. Other couples walked along the paths, always with someone watching to make sure they behaved. "Miss Fairchild," Sir James said, stopping by a rosebush, "I've been thinking about you a lot since we danced at the Johnsons' ball." Emmeline's heart beat so hard she was sure he could hear it. "You have?" "Yes, and I was wondering—" He took her hand. "Would you allow me to speak to your father about courting you?" The world seemed to stop for a moment. This was what her family had wanted for so long. This was what being a proper lady was all about, finding a good match, making a good marriage. "Yes," Emmeline said, hardly able to believe it was happening. "Yes, I would like that very much." As they walked back inside, Emmeline saw her mother's face light up with joy. She saw Lady Hargrove's mouth drop open in surprise. She saw her future laid out before her like a straight, clear path, but deep inside, a tiny voice wondered if there might be other paths, other ways to live. She pushed the thought away. This was her place. This was her duty. This was what happiness looked like, wasn't it? 3 months passed like a happy dream. Sir James came to visit Emmeline at her family's home 5 days a week. They walked in the garden, talked about his plans for his big house, and sometimes he even let her tell him about the books she read. Her mother beamed with pride whenever she saw them together. Her father nodded with approval when Sir James asked for Emmeline's hand in marriage. The date was set for the biggest, most fancy wedding London had seen in years. "You will be the most beautiful bride," Emmeline's mother said as they looked at wedding dresses in the shop. "Sir James is a good match. You have done well, my dear." Emmeline smiled. But deep down, a small worry sat in her heart. Sir James was nice to her, but sometimes his eyes would wander when she talked too long about things that interested her. Sometimes he would pat her hand and say, "That's enough about stars now, my sweet. Tell me how pretty my new horse is instead." Still, this was what she was supposed to want. This was the path laid out for girls like her. And she did care for him. She did. The night of Lord Pembroke's spring ball came with great buzz. It was the last big party before Emmeline and Sir James would be married. Everyone who was anyone would be there to see the happy couple. Emmeline's mother spent hours helping her get ready. "The emerald necklace, I think," her mother said, placing the heavy jewels around Emmeline's neck. "It matches your eyes and shows everyone that you are to be the wife of a rich man." The necklace felt cold against Emmeline's skin. She looked at herself in the mirror. Her green dress was the most costly one she'd ever worn. Her hair was put up with tiny white flowers woven through it. She looked like a proper bride-to-be. "Perfect," her mother said with a happy sigh. "Sir James will be so proud to have you on his arm tonight." The ball was already in full swing when the Fairchild family arrived. The room was bright with 100 candles. Music played, people danced and laughed. The air smelled like perfume and punch, and the sweat of too many people in one room. Lady Fairchild, Miss Fairchild, and Miss Catherine, the man at the door called out. Heads turned to look at them. Lord Pembroke came over right away. "Ah, the lovely Fairchilds. Welcome, welcome." He looked around with a small frown. "Strange, I thought Sir James would be with you." Emmeline felt her smile freeze on her face. "Is he not here yet?" Lord Pembroke's face did a funny thing, like he was trying not to show what he was thinking. "I'm sure he'll be along soon. Please, enjoy the party." But as the minutes ticked by on the big clock in the corner, Sir James did not appear. Emmeline sat with her mother, nodding and smiling as people came to talk to them, but her eyes kept going to the door. "Where could he be?" her mother whispered, her smile still in place but her eyes sharp with worry. Then Emmeline saw it. Lady Hargrove and her daughters with their heads close together, looking at her and laughing behind their fans. Lord Wilson and his friends by the punch bowl, giving her looks of pity. Something was wrong, very wrong. And then she heard it. Just a whisper at first, but soon it grew louder as it passed from ear to ear around the room. Sir James has left for the Americas. With Lord Pembroke's niece, Miss Lucy, ran off this very morning. Poor Miss Fairchild. left at the altar before she even got there. The room began to spin around Emmeline. The candles blurred into streaks of light. The music seemed to come from far away. This could not be happening. Not to her. Not when she'd done everything right, been the perfect lady, the perfect match. Her mother's face had gone white as a sheet. "It can't be true," she said, but her voice shook. Just then Lord Pembroke returned to them, his face grim. "Lady Fairchild, might I have a word, in private?" As her mother went off with Lord Pembroke, Emmeline sat alone, feeling the eyes of everyone in the room on her. The whispers grew louder, the laughs more clear. Her shame burned like fire in her chest. "Such a shame," said Lady Worthington, sitting not far from Emmeline. Her voice was just loud enough for Emmeline to hear. "But what could Sir James do? The girl has spirit and beauty. Miss Fairchild, well, she's a bit dull, isn't she? All those books and stars. No man wants that in a wife." The words cut deeper than any knife. Emmeline felt tears pushing at her eyes, but she would not cry. Not here. Not in front of these people who were enjoying her pain. Her mother returned, her face a mask of calm that did not reach her eyes. "It seems there has been a change of plans," she said in a tight voice. "Sir James has had to leave London on sudden business." But everyone knew the truth. Everyone had heard the whispers. Everyone could see the pity and cruel joy in the eyes around them. Emmeline stood up slowly, her back straight as an arrow. "I believe I need some fresh air, Mother." "Emmeline," her mother said, reaching for her hand. But Emmeline pulled away gently. "I'll just step out to the garden for a moment. I'll be fine." With every eye in the room on her, Emmeline walked across the floor, her steps measured, her head high. She would not run. She would not hide. She would walk out of this room with the little bit of pride she had left. The night air hit her hot face as she stepped onto the empty garden path. Only then did she let the first tear fall. Only then did her shoulders drop and her hands shake. Her life as she knew it was over. The wedding, the future, all of it gone in the space of an hour. What would she do now? Who would she be if not the soon-to-be Lady Harrington? A memory came to her of her father's sister, Aunt Josephine, who lived alone by the sea. Aunt Josephine, who had never married, who wrote letters full of stories about her travels and the books she read. Aunt Josephine, who had always told Emmeline that a woman could be more than just a wife. As the sound of the ball faded behind her, Emmeline made up her mind. She would not go back in there. She would not face those cruel smiles again. She would go home, pack her things, and ask her father to let her visit Aunt Josephine. She would leave this place of shame and find somewhere to heal her broken heart. Somewhere far from whispers and laughs and the eyes of a world that had watched her fall from the very top to the very bottom in a single night. The journey to Aunt Josephine's cottage by the sea took 2 full days. Emmeline watched through the carriage window as the busy streets of London gave way to green fields, then to rolling hills, and finally to the wild beauty of the Cornish coast. The air changed too, from the smoke and smells of the city to the fresh, salty tang that filled her lungs with each breath. "We'll be there soon, my lady," said Tom, the old driver who had known Emmeline since she was a little girl. His kind eyes met hers in the small mirror. "Your aunt's cottage is just round the next bend." Emmeline nodded, too tired for words. She had not slept well since that awful night at the ball. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw the faces of the people watching her, heard their whispers, felt their eyes full of pity or mean joy at her shame. The carriage rounded the bend, and there it was. A small stone cottage perched on a cliff above the sea. Smoke curled from the chimney, flowers grew in wild bunches around the door. It looked nothing like the grand houses of London, but right now that was exactly what Emmeline wanted. Aunt Josephine stood waiting at the gate. She was tall and thin with grey hair that flew around her face in the wind. She wore a simple blue dress with no fancy lace or bows. When she smiled, the lines around her eyes crinkled like tiny roads on a map. "My dear girl," she said, opening her arms wide, "welcome to Cliff Cottage." Emmeline stepped down from the carriage and fell into her aunt's hug. She smelled like sea salt and the herbs that hung drying in her kitchen. For the first time in days, Emmeline felt safe. "Thank you for having me," she said, her voice small against the crash of the waves below. "Nonsense, I'm happy for the company," Aunt Josephine said, leading her inside, "though I'm sorry for the reason you've come." The inside of the cottage was small but cosy. Books filled every shelf and spilled onto tables and chairs. A fire burned in the stone fireplace. Through the windows, Emmeline could see nothing but sky and sea stretching out forever. "Your room is up those stairs," Aunt Josephine said, pointing to a narrow wooden staircase. "It's not big, but the view will make up for it. Go rest now. We'll talk when you're ready." That first week, Emmeline hardly left her room. She slept late into the morning, waking only when the sun was high in the sky. She ate the food Aunt Josephine brought up on trays but said little. At night she cried into her pillow so her aunt wouldn't hear. Her heart felt broken into 100 tiny pieces, not just from losing Sir James, but from losing the future she had been promised all her life. Who was she now? Not a bride-to-be. Not the future Lady Harrington, just Emmeline. And she didn't know who that was anymore. On the 8th day, she woke to the sound of rain tapping on her window. The sky and sea were grey, blending together at the far edge of the world. Emmeline got up, put on the simple dress Aunt Josephine had left for her, and went downstairs. Her aunt sat by the fire reading a book. She looked up and smiled. "Good morning? Or should I say good afternoon?" Emmeline felt her face grow warm. "I'm sorry I've been such a poor guest." "You've been a heartbroken girl who needed rest," Aunt Josephine said. "There's tea in the pot and bread on the table. Eat, and then we'll talk, or not. It's up to you." After she ate, Emmeline felt stronger than she had in days. She sat across from her aunt by the fire. "I don't know what to do now," she admitted. "Everything I was raised for, everything I was supposed to be, it's all gone." Aunt Josephine closed her book and looked at Emmeline with kind eyes. "Tell me, dear, were you in love with Sir James?" The question caught Emmeline by surprise. No one had asked her that before. Not her mother, not her friends, not even herself. I thought I was," she said slowly. "But now I'm not sure. I loved the idea of him. I loved that he chose me. I loved that he made my family happy." She paused, thinking hard. "But when we talked, I always felt like I had to be careful, like I couldn't be fully myself." "And who is fully yourself?" Aunt Josephine asked. Emmeline looked out the window at the wild sea. "I don't know anymore." The next day the rain stopped and Aunt Josephine suggested a walk along the cliff path. The wind pulled at Emmeline's hair and dress as they made their way along the edge of the world. Far below, waves crashed against sharp rocks. Seagulls called overhead. The smell of salt and wet earth filled the air. "I come out here every day," Aunt Josephine said. "It reminds me how small we are, how our problems, big as they seem to us, are just tiny specks in this great big world." Emmeline thought about London, about the ballrooms and tea parties that had once seemed so important. From here, they felt far away and small. "Were you ever married, Aunt Josephine?" she asked. "Yes, for 6 months when I was about your age," her aunt said. "Thomas was a kind man, a sea captain. He died in a storm off the coast of India." She said this simply, without tears or drama. "After that, I decided to live life on my own terms. Weren't you lonely?" "Sometimes, but being alone is not the same as being lonely. I've had friends. I've had my books and my travels. I've had this sea and sky." Aunt Josephine smiled at her niece. "There are many ways to live a good life, Emmeline. Marriage is just one of them." That night, Emmeline wrote a letter to her mother, telling her she was safe and well, but would be staying with Aunt Josephine for a while. She didn't say how long, she didn't know herself. As the days passed, Emmeline began to find a rhythm to life at Cliff Cottage. She woke with the sun and helped her aunt in the small garden where they grew herbs and vegetables. She walked along the cliff paths, at first just a little way, then farther each day, as if testing her own strength. In the afternoons, when the wind was too wild to be outside, she sat by the fire and read books from her aunt's shelves. Books about far-off places and brave women who had adventures. Books about stars and plants and how the world worked. 1 month after her arrival, Emmeline found herself standing at the very edge of the cliff, looking out at the endless blue. The wind whipped around her, and for the first time she didn't try to fix her hair or worry about her dress getting dirty. She stretched out her arms and closed her eyes, feeling wild and free and somehow more herself than she had ever been before. That evening, as they sat by the fire, Emmeline said, "I was a fool to believe in love." Aunt Josephine looked up from her knitting. "Were you? Or were you a fool to believe that love could only look one way?" "What do you mean?" I mean that perhaps the error was not in trusting your heart, my dear, but in allowing others to define its worth." Emmeline thought about this as she got ready for bed. She looked at herself in the small mirror above the wash basin. Her face was the same, yet different. Her skin was touched by sun. Her hair was looser, with little bits curling free around her face. Her eyes seemed clearer, as if she could see better now. For the first time since that awful night at the ball, she didn't cry herself to sleep. Instead, she lay awake, listening to the waves crash against the cliffs and feeling something new stir inside her heart. Not love, not yet, but maybe, just maybe, the beginnings of healing. Emmeline discovered Aunt Josephine's library on a rainy Tuesday 2 months after her arrival at Cliff Cottage. She had seen the room before, of course, but had never really looked at it. Now, as the rain drummed on the roof and made rivers down the windows, Emmeline opened the heavy wooden door and stepped into a world of wonder. The small room was lined with bookshelves from floor to ceiling. Books of every size and colour filled each shelf, some standing tall and proud, others stacked on their sides when space ran out. A worn leather chair sat by the window where the light was best for reading. A small desk covered in papers stood in one corner. The whole room smelled of old paper, ink, and the lavender sachets Aunt Josephine tucked between the shelves to keep away bugs. "Oh," Emmeline said softly, running her fingers along the spines of the books. There were so many. More than she had ever seen outside of a bookshop. Books about far-off places, books about plants and animals, books about the stars and how they moved across the sky, books filled with poetry and stories. "I see you've found my treasure room," Aunt Josephine said from the doorway, a smile in her voice. Emmeline turned, feeling a bit like she'd been caught doing something wrong. In her family's home, the library had been her father's space, not for the women of the house. "I'm sorry, I didn't mean to snoop." "Snoop? My dear girl, there's nothing to snoop about in a library. Books are meant to be read, not hidden away." Aunt Josephine came into the room and pulled a thick green book from one of the shelves. "This one might interest you. It's about the stars, but it's written by a woman, Mary Somerville, very clever lady." Emmeline took the book, feeling its weight in her hands. "A woman wrote this?" "Women write all sorts of things when they're given the chance," Aunt Josephine winked. "Some of my favourite books are by ladies with big brains and bold ideas." That night, Emmeline stayed up late reading by candlelight. The book was hard in places, with words she didn't know, but it made her feel alive in a way that gossip and dresses and tea parties never had. She fell asleep with the book on her chest and dreamed of stars dancing around her head. The next day, and the next, and the one after that, Emmeline returned to the library. She read about stars and plants. She read stories of brave women who crossed oceans and climbed mountains. She read poems that made her cry and laugh at the same time. "Your mind is too special to waste," Aunt Josephine said one afternoon, finding Emmeline deep in a book about math. "I've always thought so, even when you were a little girl asking why the sky is blue." Emmeline looked up, surprised. "You remember that?" "Of course. You asked more questions than any child I'd ever met." Aunt Josephine sat in the chair across from Emmeline. "Society has never known what to do with women who think." "And what should such women do?" Emmeline asked. "Live," her aunt said simply, "on their own terms." Emmeline thought about this as she fell asleep that night. Live on her own terms? But what did that mean? What were her terms? For so long she had lived by her family's rules, by society's rules. She wasn't sure she knew how to make her own. The next morning, Emmeline found a small notebook on her bedside table bound in soft blue leather. Inside, a note from Aunt Josephine. "For your thoughts and questions, the world needs more of both." Emmeline took the notebook with her on her daily walk along the cliffs. She sat on a rock warmed by the sun, the sea spread out before her like a blue blanket, and opened to the first clean page. What did she want? Who did she want to be? The question seemed both simple and impossible to answer. She put her pen to the page and began to write. Not answers, but questions. Why did the tide go in and out? How did birds know which way to fly when the seasons changed? Why did society care more about a woman's face than her mind? Why had she never questioned this before? That evening she showed some of her questions to Aunt Josephine. "Excellent questions," her aunt said, eyes twinkling. "Now how will you find the answers?" "I don't know," Emmeline admitted. "In London, ladies aren't supposed to ask such things." "Well, you're not in London anymore, are you?" Aunt Josephine got up and went to her desk. She came back with a stack of letters tied with string. "These are from friends of mine, other women who ask questions, who study and think and write, women like Mary Somerville, whose book you're reading." Emmeline's eyes went wide. "You know her?" "I've met her once or twice. Wonderful mind. But there are many others." Women who study the stars, women who collect plants and bugs, women who write stories that make people think in new ways. Aunt Josephine handed the letters to Emmeline. "Read these. See that you're not alone in wanting more than society offers you." The letters opened a new world to Emmeline. Women in London, in Edinburgh, in Paris and Rome, all thinking and writing and studying. Some had husbands who supported their work. Some lived alone or with other women like themselves. All had found ways to live with minds that wouldn't stay quiet, that wouldn't be satisfied with just gossip and fashion. "I want to be like them," Emmeline said one night as she and Aunt Josephine sat by the fire. "But I don't know how. I don't have their knowledge, their education." "You have a mind that wants to learn." "That's the most important thing." Aunt Josephine poked at the fire, sending sparks up the chimney. "When I was widowed at 22, I knew nothing of the world, but I was hungry to learn, so I read everything I could get my hands on. I wrote to clever people and asked questions. I travelled when I could, and bit by bit I built my own education." "Did people think you were strange?" Emmeline asked. "Oh yes," Aunt Josephine laughed. "They still do, but I stopped caring about that long ago." The days grew shorter as summer turned to fall. Emmeline spent her mornings helping in the garden, picking the last of the summer vegetables before the frost came. In the afternoons, she read in the library or wrote in her blue notebook. In the evenings, she and Aunt Josephine sat by the fire, talking about the books they'd read or the letters that arrived from Aunt Josephine's friends all over the world. One such friend, a Mrs. Carrington who lived in the nearby town, wrote to invite them to a small gathering at her home. A literary salon, the letter said. Just a few friends who enjoy good books and good talk. Emmeline felt her stomach tighten at the thought of seeing people again. "I'm not ready," she said when Aunt Josephine showed her the letter. "Perhaps not," her aunt agreed, "but Mrs. Carrington's gatherings are nothing like London balls. The people there care about ideas, not gossip. They won't know or care about what happened to you." Still, Emmeline hesitated. It had been 4 months since she left London. 4 months of healing and reading and thinking. She had changed, she knew. Her hands were no longer soft and white, but had small calluses from working in the garden. Her face had freckles from the sun. Her mind was full of new ideas and questions, but was she ready to face the world again, even a small part of it? "Think about it," Aunt Josephine said, not pushing. "The gathering isn't for another 2 weeks." That night, Emmeline stood at her window, looking out at the stars that seemed to hang just above the cottage roof. She thought about all the women in Aunt Josephine's letters, women who had found ways to live with minds that needed more than society wanted to give them. They had been brave. Could she be brave too? "I was raised to seek approval," she whispered to the stars, "but maybe it's time I learned to approve of myself." The next morning, Emmeline told Aunt Josephine she would go to Mrs. Carrington's salon. It was time to test her new self, to see if the strength she'd been building was real. Time to step out of the shadow of her shame and into the light of her own making. Mrs. Carrington's house stood on a hill overlooking the small town. It was not as grand as the London homes Emmeline had once visited, but it had a warm, welcoming feel that put her at ease as soon as she stepped through the door. The walls were painted a soft yellow that glowed in the afternoon sun. Books and paintings filled every space, and the smell of fresh flowers mixed with the rich scent of tea. "Josephine, my dear friend," Mrs. Carrington hurried to greet them. She was a small, round woman with kind eyes and grey curls that bounced when she moved. "And this must be your niece, Emmeline. Welcome, my dear. I'm so pleased you could join us." Emmeline gave a small curtsy, the habit still in her after years of training. "Thank you for having me, Mrs. Carrington. Please call me Helen. We don't stand on ceremony here." She led them into a cosy sitting room where 6 other people, 3 women and 3 men, sat in a circle of comfortable chairs. "Everyone, this is Josephine's niece, Emmeline Fairchild." Emmeline felt her heart race as all eyes turned to her. Would they know? Had the gossip about her shame reached even this small corner of Cornwall? but the faces that looked back at her showed only friendly interest, not a hint of the cruel pity she had seen that awful night in London. "Miss Fairchild has been staying with me these past months," Aunt Josephine said, giving Emmeline's hand a squeeze. "She has become quite the scholar, devouring every book in my library." "A fellow reader? How wonderful!" A woman with spectacles and a book already open in her lap smiled warmly. "I'm Mrs. Lewis. What sort of books do you enjoy, Miss Fairchild?" "I've been reading about the stars lately," Emmeline said, surprised at how steady her voice sounded, "and natural history." "Excellent choices," Mrs. Lewis beamed. "Mr. Thompson here knows quite a bit about the stars. He has a fine telescope at his home." An older gentleman with wild white hair nodded. "Indeed. You're welcome to visit and have a look through it sometime, Miss Fairchild. The night skies here are much clearer than in London." The conversation flowed easily after that. These people talked of books and ideas, not gossip and fashion. They asked questions and actually listened to the answers. When Emmeline mentioned Mary Somerville's work, no one looked shocked that she had read such a book. Instead, they asked what she thought of it, and recommended other books she might enjoy. Tea was served, and small cakes that melted in Emmeline's mouth. The afternoon light slanted through the windows, making pools of gold on the carpet. For the first time in months, Emmeline found herself truly relaxed in the company of others. Then the door opened, and Helen Carrington's voice rang out with fresh excitement. "Ah, Your Grace! I was beginning to think you wouldn't join us today." Emmeline turned to see a tall man with broad shoulders step into the room. He wore a simple dark coat, but something in the way he carried himself spoke of quiet authority. His face was handsome in a serious way, with thoughtful brown eyes and a strong jaw. "Forgive my lateness, Mrs. Carrington. My carriage was delayed." His voice was deep and pleasant, with a slight accent Emmeline couldn't place. "Not to worry. Let me introduce you to our newest guest, Your Grace. This is Miss Emmeline Fairchild, Josephine Hartley's niece. Miss Fairchild, may I present His Grace, the Duke of Westmoreland." A duke! Emmeline felt her old self rise up in panic. In London, a duke was so far above her in rank that she would have been tongue-tied in his presence. But the new Emmeline, the one who had walked the wild cliffs and read books by candlelight, simply rose and gave a small curtsy. "It's a pleasure to meet you, Your Grace." The Duke bowed. "The pleasure is mine, Miss Fairchild." He glanced at the book in her lap. "I see you're reading about the stars." "A subject close to my heart." Emmeline blinked in surprise. "You're interested in astronomy?" "Very much so. I've just returned from Vienna, where I had the chance to visit their observatory. Quite impressive." Mrs. Carrington smiled brightly. "His Grace has been serving as a diplomat for the past 3 years. He's only recently returned to England." The Duke took a seat across from Emmeline. Mrs. Carrington mentioned in her letters that her literary gatherings were full of interesting minds. I see she was not exaggerating. The conversation turned to Vienna and the Duke's travels. He spoke of museums and libraries, of scholars he had met and ideas he had encountered. Emmeline found herself leaning forward, drinking in every word. This was a world she had never known existed, a world where people travelled not just for pleasure but for knowledge. "And what brings you to Cornwall, Your Grace?" Mr. Thompson asked. "It's a bit off the usual path for someone just returned from the continent." "Family property," the Duke replied. "My mother's family had a home near here. I've inherited it, and thought to see if it might serve as a quiet retreat for study and writing." "The old Blackwood estate?" Aunt Josephine asked. The Duke nodded. "Indeed. You know it?" "I've walked past it many times. Lovely grounds, though I hear the house needs work." "More than a little," the Duke admitted with a smile that softened his serious face. "But the library is intact, and there's a fine spot on the eastern hill that would be perfect for a small observatory." "An observatory!" Emmeline couldn't help her exclamation. "You mean to build one?" "If the skies prove as clear as I hope," the Duke said. "I've been working on some calculations for navigation using the stars. It's a bit of a passion project." Mrs. Lewis looked at Emmeline with bright eyes. "Miss Fairchild has been studying stellar cartography as well, Your Grace. Josephine tells me she's quite taken with it." Emmeline felt her face grow warm. "I'm only just learning. It's all very new to me." "We're all always learning," the Duke said kindly. "That's the joy of it." The afternoon passed quickly after that. The Duke spoke more of his travels and his work. Others shared books they had read or ideas they were exploring. Emmeline mostly listened. but when she did speak, everyone seemed genuinely interested in what she had to say. No one cut her off or changed the subject when she talked about stars or plants. No one told her that such things weren't proper for a young lady to discuss. As the sun began to set, casting long shadows across Mrs. Carrington's sitting room, Emmeline realised she had spent 3 hours in the company of strangers without once feeling ashamed or afraid. 3 hours where she had been seen not as a failed bride or a scandal, but as a person with a mind worth knowing. "You must all come to dinner next week," Mrs. Carrington announced as they prepared to leave. "I've had a letter from my friend Mrs. Whitmore. She's sending me a fascinating book on marine plants that she discovered in Scotland. We can discuss it together." "That sounds wonderful," Emmeline said, surprised at how much she meant it. The Duke of Westmoreland bowed over her hand. "I look forward to continuing our conversation about stellar navigation, Miss Fairchild. Perhaps you might even be willing to review some of my calculations. A fresh pair of eyes often sees what the original has missed." Emmeline felt a flutter in her chest that had nothing to do with fear or shame. "I would be honoured, Your Grace, though I'm not sure how much help I could be." "You underestimate yourself," the Duke said, his brown eyes serious. "Mrs. Carrington tells me you have a remarkable mind. In my experience, she's rarely wrong about people." On the carriage ride back to Cliff Cottage, Emmeline was quiet, watching the stars come out one by one in the darkening sky. She thought of the Duke's deep voice as he spoke of Vienna, of the respect in his eyes when he asked about her studies, of the way no one in that cosy room had treated her as less for being a woman with a curious mind. "Well?" Aunt Josephine asked, a smile in her voice. "What did you think of your first venture back into society?" Emmeline turned from the window, her face glowing in the dim light of the carriage lamp. It was nothing like London. These people talk about real things, important things, not just who's marrying whom or what someone wore to a ball. "Yes, that's why I enjoy Helen's gatherings." Aunt Josephine patted Emmeline's hand. "And what did you think of the Duke? Rather different from the gentleman you knew in London, I imagine. He's—" Emmeline paused, searching for the right words. "He's like someone from another world. The way he talked about his travels and his studies. The way he actually listened when I spoke. The way he looked at you," Aunt Josephine added with a twinkle in her eye. "Aunt Josephine!" Emmeline felt her face grow warm again. "He was simply being polite." "If you say so, my dear." Aunt Josephine looked out at the stars, a small smile playing at the corners of her mouth. "But I've known many polite men in my time, and few of them look at a woman's mind with such clear admiration." The local museum was small, just 3 rooms in an old stone building near the town square, but Emmeline felt a thrill of excitement as she climbed the worn steps. It had been 2 weeks since Mrs. Carrington's salon, 2 weeks of thinking about stars and navigation, and the Duke's deep voice as he spoke of his travels. "Miss Fairchild?" The Duke himself stood waiting in the entrance hall. Today he wore a blue coat that brought out the warmth in his brown eyes. "Thank you for agreeing to meet me here." "Thank you for the invitation, Your Grace." Emmeline was glad her voice sounded steady, even as her heart beat faster than usual. "I've never visited this museum before. It's a hidden treasure. The curator has assembled quite a remarkable collection of maritime maps and navigational tools." He offered his arm. "Shall we?" Emmeline placed her hand lightly on his sleeve. The solid warmth of him seemed to travel through her gloved fingers and up her arm. This close, she could smell the clean scent of his shaving soap and something else. Ink and paper like the library at Cliff Cottage. "I've brought the calculations I mentioned," the Duke said as they walked into the first room. "But first, I thought you might enjoy seeing these." The room held glass cases filled with compasses, sextants, and other tools Emmeline had read about but never seen. Maps hung on the walls, yellowed with age, showing coastlines and sea routes with tiny ships painted in the corners. "These are beautiful," Emmeline said, bending to look at a small brass instrument in one of the cases. "That's an astrolabe," the Duke explained, leaning down beside her. "Sailors used it to measure the height of the sun or stars above the horizon. With that information and a good set of tables, they could work out their position at sea. Like the calculations you're working on?" The Duke smiled, clearly pleased by her understanding. "Exactly. Though I'm trying to make the process more accurate and easier to use in rough conditions." They moved slowly through the museum, the Duke explaining each artifact with knowledge and passion. Emmeline found herself asking questions she would never have dared ask in London society, and the Duke answered each one thoughtfully, never once making her feel foolish for asking. In the third room, a large table held an open book of star charts. The Duke guided Emmeline toward it, his hand warm on the small of her back. "This is what I especially wanted to show you," he said. "These charts were made by a woman, though her husband put his name on them. Mrs. Carrington told me the whole story." Emmeline studied the careful drawings of star positions. "How do you know a woman made them?" The curator found her journal after her death. It detailed all her observations and calculations. The Duke's voice grew soft. She wrote that she didn't mind her husband taking credit. She said the work itself was the joy, not the recognition. Emmeline thought about that as they left the museum and walked toward the small tea shop on the corner. The day was crisp and clear, with white clouds sailing across a blue sky like ships. Leaves crunched under their feet, red and gold and brown. "Do you think she was right?" Emmeline asked as they sat at a small table by the window. "That the work itself should be enough?" The Duke considered her question, his face serious. "I think she had few choices in her time, but I believe recognition matters. When we acknowledge the work of those society often overlooks, women, people from far-off places, those without wealth or title, we all benefit from their gifts." A warm feeling spread through Emmeline's chest, and it wasn't from the tea the shop owner placed before them. "Is that why you asked for my help with your calculations? Because you believe a woman's mind has value?" "I asked for your help because Mrs. Carrington said you have a remarkable clarity of thought, and because the questions you asked at her salon showed a deep understanding of stellar principles." The Duke smiled. "Your being a woman has nothing to do with the quality of your mind, though everything to do with society's failure to value it properly." They spent the next hour with their heads bent over papers spread across the tea table. The Duke's calculations were complex, but Emmeline found she could follow his reasoning and even spot a small error in one section. Instead of being upset, the Duke seemed delighted by her discovery. "This is exactly why fresh eyes are so valuable," he said, making a note in the margin. "I've been staring at these numbers so long I couldn't see what was right in front of me." On the walk back to where their carriages waited, the Duke told Emmeline about his years in Vienna, about the people he had met and the ideas they had shared. "My colleagues thought me odd for consulting a woman's astronomical calculations on our journey home," he admitted. "And yet you did," Emmeline noted, remembering the charts at the museum. The Duke's eyes met hers, warm and steady. "I have found that wisdom often lives where most people don't think to look, and beauty too, sometimes." Emmeline felt her face grow warm, but she didn't look away. For the first time, she saw herself through someone else's eyes, not as a failed bride or a social disgrace, but as a person of value, a mind worth knowing, perhaps even a woman worth admiring. The next meeting happened at the cliffs near Cliff Cottage. The Duke had asked if he might see the spot where Emmeline did her stargazing, and Aunt Josephine had readily agreed, a twinkle in her eye as she suggested they take a picnic supper and wait for the stars to come out. The picnic basket sat between them on a blanket spread over the soft grass. The sun was setting over the sea, painting the water gold and red. A cool breeze carried the salt smell of the ocean and the sweet scent of the last summer flowers. "In Vienna, I lived in the city, surrounded by buildings and people," the Duke said, watching the sun sink lower. "I had forgotten how it feels to sit under an open sky. This is my favourite place in the world," Emmeline admitted. "When I first came here, I was so sad and angry. But sitting here, watching the stars come out one by one, I started to feel better. Smaller somehow, but in a good way." The Duke nodded. "The stars remind us of our true size in the universe. Not as lords or ladies or even dukes," he smiled, "but as thinking beings trying to understand the wonder around us. As the sky darkened, stars began to appear, first just the brightest ones, then more and more until the black dome above them was scattered with points of light." Emmeline named the constellations as they appeared, surprised at how much she had learned in the months since coming to Cornwall. "Your knowledge is impressive," the Duke said, his voice soft in the darkness. "You've learned in months what took me years to master. I had a good teacher in my aunt and many books to read, and a natural gift." The Duke's hand found hers on the blanket. "You see patterns where others see only scattered stars." His touch was warm and Emmeline didn't pull away. In the starlight his face looked younger, less serious. She wondered what her own face showed in this gentle light. Hope, fear, the strange new feeling that had been growing in her heart since that first day at Mrs. Carrington's. "I should take you home before your aunt begins to worry," the Duke said at last, though he made no move to stand. She won't worry. She trusts me to make my own choices now. Emmeline turned her hand in his so their palms met, fingers interlacing. That's the greatest gift she's given me. The belief that I can choose my own path. The Duke's eyes held hers in the starlight. And what path are you choosing, Miss Fairchild? I don't know yet. Emmeline's voice was soft but sure. But I know I can never go back to the one laid out for me in London. I need a life with room for questions and learning, for looking at stars and making maps and reading books that make me think. Such a life exists. The Duke's voice was as gentle as his hold on her hand. I've seen it, in Vienna, in Paris, even in quiet corners of England. There are people, men and women, who live for ideas, for discovery, for understanding the world, not for balls and gossip and who's marrying whom. People like us? Emmeline asked, hardly believing her own boldness. The Duke smiled, and it transformed his serious face into something warm and full of promise. Yes, Emmeline, people exactly like us. 3 days later, they met again, this time in the reading room of the town's small library. Rain pattered against the windows as they sat at a wooden table covered with books and papers. The smell of old books and wet wool coats hung in the air. A fire crackled in the small fireplace, casting dancing light over their work. I've had a letter from the Royal Astronomical Society, the Duke said, pushing a piece of paper toward Emmeline. They're interested in our calculations for navigational purposes. Our calculations? Emmeline looked up, surprised. I included your corrections and additions, and I put your name alongside mine as co-author. The Duke's face was serious. If that's acceptable to you. Emmeline stared at the letter, at her name written there in black ink. Miss Emmeline Fairchild, co-author with His Grace, the Duke of Westmoreland. Not wife of, not daughter of, just her own name, her own mind recognised for its worth. More than acceptable, she whispered. Thank you. The Duke's hand covered hers on the table. No, Emmeline, thank you. For seeing what I missed, for asking questions no one else thought to ask, for being a mind worth knowing. In that moment, with rain on the windows and books all around them, and the warmth of his hand on hers, Emmeline felt something bloom in her heart. Not the fluttery, anxious feeling she had once had with Sir James. This was deeper, steadier, like the constant stars above the ever-changing sea. This was a feeling built on being seen and valued for her true self, not for her family name or her pretty face or her proper manners. And for the first time since that awful night at the ball, Emmeline allowed herself to imagine a future, not the one that had been planned for her, but one she might choose for herself. A future with books and stars and questions. A future perhaps with the man sitting across from her, whose eyes held not just admiration, but a growing tenderness that matched the feeling in her own heart. The letter from Emmeline's mother arrived on a bright winter morning. Snow dusted the ground outside Cliff Cottage like sugar on a cake. The fire crackled in the hearth as Emmeline broke the wax seal and unfolded the thin paper. Oh, she said softly as she read the first lines. Aunt Josephine looked up from her knitting. Bad news? Not exactly. Emmeline kept reading, her eyes moving quickly over her mother's neat handwriting. Sir James is back in London. His time in America didn't go well. The girl he ran off with married someone else. I see. Aunt Josephine's needles clicked steadily. And what does your mother have to say about that? Emmeline's hands tightened on the paper. She says that Sir James has asked about me, that he's hinted he might still be willing to marry me if I return to London, that the scandal has died down enough that we could still have a good match. She looked up at her aunt, her eyes wide. She wants me to come home. And what do you want? Aunt Josephine asked quietly. Emmeline stood and walked to the window. Outside, the sea stretched grey and endless under the winter sky. 6 months ago, she had arrived at Cliff Cottage broken and lost. Now, looking at the wild beauty of the coast, at the books piled on every table, at the blue notebook filled with her thoughts and questions, she felt a strength she'd never known in London. I want, she started, then stopped, surprised by the force of her own feelings. I want to stay here. I want to keep learning and asking questions. I want to work with the Duke on our star charts. I want a life that's bigger than tea parties and gossip. Aunt Josephine smiled, the lines around her eyes crinkling. Then that's what you should tell your mother. Emmeline sat down at the small writing desk and pulled out a fresh sheet of paper. Her pen scratched across the page as she wrote about her new life, about the friends she had made, about the work she was doing. She did not mention the Duke directly, though his presence filled the empty spaces between her words. When she was done, she folded the letter, sealed it with wax, and set it aside to be posted. "There," she said, feeling lighter. "I've made my choice. But life has a way of testing our choices, of making us prove how much we mean what we say." The test came 3 days later when Emmeline and the Duke were walking through the snow-covered grounds of his estate. The old house stood half-repaired on the hill, windows boarded up, scaffolding around one wing. But the Duke had cleared a path through the garden, and they walked slowly, gloved hands brushing against each other, breath-making white clouds in the cold air. "I've had an offer from the Royal Society in Vienna," the Duke said, his deep voice serious. "They want me to return and lead a new project on navigation. It would mean leaving England for at least a year. Perhaps longer." Emmeline felt her heart skip. "That's a great honour." "It is." The Duke stopped walking and turned to face her, "But I find myself reluctant to accept." "Why?" His eyes met hers, warm brown against the white and grey world around them. "Because of you, Emmeline. Because in these past months you have become important to me. More than important." Emmeline's breath caught in her throat. Though they had grown close, though their hands had touched and their eyes had held silent conversations, neither had spoken openly of feelings beyond friendship and scholarly respect. "You've become important to me too," she said softly. The Duke took her gloved hands in his. "I've been thinking, the project in Vienna, there would be a place for a co-researcher, someone with a keen mind for astronomical calculations." "Someone like you?" Emmeline stared at him. "Me? In Vienna?" "Yes." His eyes were serious, searching her face. "It would be unconventional, of course. You would need a companion. Perhaps your aunt would consider joining us. But there are women in the scientific community there. You would not be alone." The world seemed to spin around Emmeline. Vienna, a city she had only read about in books, a place where she could work alongside the Duke, be part of something important, use her mind in ways London society had never allowed. "I would need time to think about it," she said honestly. The Duke nodded. "Of course, it's a big decision." He squeezed her hands gently. "But I want you to know that whatever you decide, my feelings for you will not change. If you choose to stay in England, I will find a way to return to you." As they walked back toward where their carriages waited, snow began to fall again, soft white flakes that caught in Emmeline's hair and on the shoulders of the Duke's coat. The world was quiet except for the crunch of their boots on the snowy path and the soft patter of snowflakes on bare branches. Emmeline thought about choices, about paths taken and not taken, about the girl she'd been in London and the woman she was becoming here in Cornwall, about Vienna and stars and the warmth of the Duke's hands on hers. The next day brought another visitor to Cliff Cottage, one Emmeline never expected to see again. She was sitting in the library reading by the fire when Aunt Josephine came in, her face tight with surprise and worry. "You have a caller," she said. "Sir James Harrington." Emmeline's book fell from her hands. "Sir James? Here?" "Yes. He's in the sitting room." Aunt Josephine's eyes were hard. "I can send him away if you wish." Emmeline thought for a long moment. 6 months ago, the sight of Sir James would have broken her heart all over again. But now she was curious more than anything else. "No, I'll speak with him." Sir James stood by the window of the small sitting room, looking out at the sea. He turned when Emmeline entered, and she was struck by how unchanged he was. The same handsome face, the same confident stance. He had been the centre of her world once. Now he seemed smaller somehow, less impressive. "Emmeline?" He stepped toward her, hands outstretched. "How well you look." She didn't take his hands. "Thank you. What brings you to Cornwall?" "Sir James?" He dropped his hands, a flicker of surprise crossing his face at her cool tone. "You, of course. Didn't you get your mother's letter? I've come to bring you home." "Home? To London? To your family?" Sir James smiled the smile that had once made her heart flutter. Now it left her unmoved. "I've spoken to your father. He agrees that we can still make a match of it, despite everything." Emmeline felt a strange calm settle over her. "You mean despite the fact that you left me for another woman? That you humiliated me in front of all of London society?" Sir James had the grace to look uncomfortable. "That was unfortunate. I was led astray by a pretty face and wild promises, but I've learned my lesson. I'm ready to settle down now to be the husband you deserve." "The husband I deserve?" Emmeline's voice was quiet but firm. "And what kind of husband do you think that is, Sir James?" He looked puzzled by the question. "A good one, of course. A man with a fine house and land. A man who can give you children and a position in society." "And what about my mind, my thoughts, the things I care about?" Now he looked truly confused. What about them? In that moment, Emmeline saw with perfect clarity the life she would have had as Lady Harrington. A life of pretty dresses and tea parties. A life where her mind would slowly wither from disuse. A life of being seen but never truly known. "I've changed, Sir James," she said gently. "I'm not the same girl you left behind." He frowned. "You look the same to me. A bit more colour in your cheeks, perhaps. But still, my pretty Emmeline. That's just it. I was never truly yours. And I was never truly known to you." She took a deep breath. "I can't go back to London with you. I can't marry you." Sir James's face darkened. "Is there someone else? Your mother mentioned some duke who's been calling on you. Has he turned your head with fancy titles?" Emmeline almost laughed. "The Duke of Westmoreland values me for my mind, not my pretty face. He sees me, really sees me, in a way you never did." "Your mind?" Sir James scoffed. "What use is a woman's mind? Your job would be to run my household and give me sons." "And that," Emmeline said calmly, "is why I cannot marry you. I wish you well, Sir James, but my answer is no." His face turned red with anger. "You'll regret this, Emmeline. No one turns down Sir James Harrington. You'll end up a lonely spinster with nothing but books for company." For the first time since he arrived, Emmeline smiled. "That doesn't sound so terrible to me. Good day, Sir James." After he left, slamming the cottage door behind him, Emmeline stood at the window watching his carriage roll away. She felt light, as if a weight she hadn't known she was carrying had been lifted from her shoulders. Aunt Josephine came to stand beside her. "Are you all right?" "Yes." Emmeline was surprised to find it was true. "I am. 6 months ago, his leaving broke my heart. Today, I sent him away and felt only relief." "And what will you do now?" Aunt Josephine asked. "The Duke's offer." Emmeline turned from the window. "I've been thinking about it all night. Vienna, a new city, new ideas, new people." She took her aunt's hands. "Would you really come with me?" "My dear girl, I've been ready for a new adventure for years." Aunt Josephine's eyes twinkled. "But are you sure? It's a big step." Emmeline thought of the Duke's warm eyes, of star charts and questions and a life filled with learning. She thought of Sir James and his dismissal of her mind. She thought of London society with its rigid rules and small lives. "I'm sure," she said. "I choose Vienna. I choose the stars. I choose a life where I can be all of myself, not just the pretty, quiet parts." The next day, Emmeline sat at the small desk in her room and wrote 2 letters. The first was to her mother, explaining her decision not to return to London, not to marry Sir James, but to go to Vienna instead. She wrote of the work she would do there, of the life she was choosing for herself. She asked for understanding, if not approval. The second letter was to the Duke, accepting his offer. She wrote of her conversation with Sir James, of the clarity it had given her, of her readiness to step into a new life, a bigger world. She wrote of stars and questions and the joy of being truly seen. When both letters were sealed, she walked to the cliff's edge and looked out at the vast sea and sky. 6 months ago she had stood in this same spot, broken and lost. Today she stood tall and certain, a woman who knew her own mind and heart, a woman brave enough to choose her own fate. The wedding took place in Aunt Josephine's garden on a perfect spring morning. Pink and white flowers bloomed along the stone paths. The sea sparkled blue and endless beyond the cliff's edge. Birds sang in the old apple tree that stood in the centre of the garden, its branches heavy with sweet-smelling blossoms that drifted down like snow when the breeze blew. Only 5 people stood witness to the ceremony: Aunt Josephine, Mrs. Carrington, Mr. Thompson with his wild white hair, Mrs. Lewis with her kind eyes, and the local minister who spoke the ancient words that would bind Emmeline and the Duke together. Emmeline wore a simple dress of pale blue, the colour of a clear spring sky. No fancy lace, no heavy train, no diamonds at her throat. Her hair was tied back with a ribbon, with one small white flower tucked behind her ear. She held a bunch of wildflowers picked that morning from the cliffs. So different from what would have been, Aunt Josephine whispered, as Emmeline stood before the mirror in her small bedroom. Do you ever think of that other wedding? The one that didn't happen? Emmeline smiled at her aunt in the mirror. Sometimes. It would have been at St. George's in London. 500 guests. A dress that cost more than this whole cottage. My father would have given me away to a man who didn't truly know me. She turned to face her aunt. This is better. Smaller, yes, but more true. Now, standing beside the Duke in the garden, with the sun warm on her face and the salt breeze playing with her hair, Emmeline felt a deep, steady joy fill her heart. The Duke, James, as she now called him, looked at her not with the shallow admiration Sir James had shown, but with a depth of feeling that came from truly knowing her. I take you, Emmeline, he said, his voice clear and strong, not as a possession or an ornament, but as my partner in all things, in work and in play, in thought and in feeling, in this world and whatever may lie beyond it. Tears filled Emmeline's eyes as she repeated her own vows, not the traditional words about obeying, but promises to stand beside him, to share her thoughts and her heart, to build a life of meaning and purpose together. When the minister pronounced them husband and wife, the small group cheered. No grand reception followed, no dancing or fancy food. Just a simple meal in Aunt Josephine's dining room, with talk and laughter and a feeling of family that had nothing to do with blood and everything to do with understanding. To Vienna, Mrs. Carrington said, raising a glass in a toast. May it be the beginning of a great adventure. To the stars, Mr. Thompson added with a twinkle in his eye. May they guide you well. Later, as the evening grew dark and the first stars appeared in the sky, Emmeline and James walked along the cliff path one last time. Tomorrow they would leave for Vienna, along with Aunt Josephine, who had packed her bags with more excitement than Emmeline had ever seen in her. Are you nervous? James asked, his arm warm around her waist. A little, Emmeline admitted. It's a big world out there, so much bigger than the one I knew in London. But not too big for your brave heart, he said, kissing the top of her head. Emmeline smiled up at the stars that had become her friends over these months of healing and growing. No, not too big. Just big enough to hold all the questions I want to ask, all the things I want to learn. James's eyes were serious as he turned to face her. I want you to know something, Emmeline. Whatever happens in Vienna, whatever work we do or don't do, whatever people say or think about us, none of that matters as much as your happiness. If you ever want to come back to England, just say the word. Emmeline stood on her toes and kissed him, a gentle touch of lips that held the promise of deeper passion to come. Thank you, but I'm not afraid anymore. I'm ready for whatever comes next, as long as we face it together. The journey to Vienna took 2 weeks by ship and carriage. Emmeline watched in wonder as the green fields of England gave way to the mountains and forests of Europe. Each new city they passed through was a feast for her eyes and mind. Buildings taller than any she had seen, people speaking languages she didn't understand, food with taste that danced on her tongue. Aunt Josephine, who had travelled in her younger days, pointed out sights and shared stories. James answered Emmeline's endless questions about the history and science of the places they passed through. For the first time in her life, Emmeline felt her world expanding with each mile, growing bigger and richer and more exciting. Vienna itself took her breath away when they finally arrived. The buildings were like something from a fairy tale, with towers and domes and walls the colour of cream. Music seemed to float in the air, coming from open windows and street corners. The people moved with purpose and pride, many carrying books or papers, hurrying to universities and coffee houses where ideas were shared and debated. Their new home was a spacious apartment near the centre of the city. Large windows let in streams of light, bookshelves lined the walls, ready to be filled. A room at the back had been set up as a study where they could work on their star charts and calculations. What do you think? James asked as Emmeline walked from room to room, trailing her fingers along the walls as if to convince herself it was all real. It's perfect, she said, her voice full of wonder. I never imagined living in such a place. Aunt Josephine, who had her own smaller apartment just next door, came in with a basket of bread and cheese and wine. Our first meal in Vienna, she announced. Let's eat by the window and watch the city go by. As they ate, James told them about the work they would be doing with the Royal Society. "They're very excited to meet you both," he said. "Especially you, Emmeline. They've seen our calculations and were most impressed." Emmeline felt a flutter of nerves. "Will they really accept me? A woman with no formal education?" "They will when they see your mind at work," James said with complete confidence. "Vienna isn't London. Women are part of the scientific community here. Not as many as there should be, perhaps, but enough that you won't be alone." The next morning, James took Emmeline to the Royal Society building, a grand structure with marble steps and tall columns. Inside, the walls were lined with books and scientific instruments. Men in dark coats moved about, carrying papers and talking in low voices. A few women were among them, dressed simply but with an air of purpose that made Emmeline stand straighter. "Your Grace," an older man with kind eyes and a white beard greeted them. "And this must be your wife, the mathematical mind we've heard so much about." "Dr. Weber. May I present the Duchess of Westmoreland," James said formally. Then with a warm smile, though in her work she still uses her family name Fairchild. Dr. Weber bowed over Emmeline's hand. "Miss Fairchild, then, in these halls, we're honoured to have you join our project. Your work on stellar navigation is most impressive." Emmeline felt a warm glow spread through her chest. Not the blush of being admired for her face or her dress, but the deeper, steadier warmth of being valued for her mind. 6 months passed in a whirl of work and discovery. Emmeline spent her days at the Royal Society, working alongside James and the other scientists on their navigation project. Her nights were filled with dinners and talks where ideas flowed as freely as the wine. She made friends among the other women scientists, a botanist from France, an astronomer from Italy, a mathematician from Germany. They met for coffee and shared stories of their journeys to this place where their minds were valued. Aunt Josephine bloomed too, learning the language quickly and making friends among the city's artists and writers. She started writing a book about her travels, sitting for hours at the small desk in her apartment, her pen scratching across the page. On a crisp fall evening, exactly 1 year from the day of her humiliation at Lord Pembroke's ball, Emmeline stood at the window of their apartment, looking out at the lights of Vienna. James came up behind her, wrapping his arms around her waist and resting his chin on top of her head. "Happy?" he asked softly. Emmeline leaned back against his solid warmth. "Very." "Doctor, Weber told me today that our new star charts will be published next month, with both our names on them." "As it should be." James turned her gently to face him. "I have news too. The Royal Society has asked me to lead an expedition to Greece next summer to observe the stars from Mount Olympus." Emmeline's eyes widened. "Greece? That sounds wonderful." "They want you to come too, as a full member of the team, not just as my wife." James's eyes were bright with pride. "They specifically asked for you. Your work on the latest calculations impressed everyone." Emmeline thought of the girl she'd been a year ago, sitting in London ballrooms, hoping for a dance with Sir James, believing that marriage was the only path to happiness. That girl could never have imagined standing in Vienna, being invited to join a scientific expedition, having her name on star charts that sailors would use to find their way home. "I was thinking," James said, taking her hands in his, "that after Greece, we might travel more. There are observatories in Italy, in France, even as far as Egypt. The world is full of stars waiting to be mapped. And questions waiting to be asked," Emmeline added with a smile. Later that night, as James slept beside her, Emmeline lay awake, watching the moonlight paint silver patterns on the ceiling. She thought about paths taken and not taken, about the heartbreak that had seemed like the end of her world, but had instead been the beginning of a new one, about the joy of being truly seen, truly known, truly valued. What once had been her greatest shame had led her to her deepest happiness. Not the shallow, fleeting happiness of a good match or a fine home, but the lasting joy of living fully as herself, mind and heart and soul, all growing together under the vast star-filled sky of a life she had chosen.